Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series, Dumbfounding Definitions, Dizzying Distinctions, and Diabolical Doctrines, a series sorting through some of the jargon of philosophy, and finally finishing up the originally planned set of videos in our series, analyzing African philosophy. In this video, we're going to be looking at what is Pan-Africanism. Now, before we get started, it's important to note we will be continuing this series after this video. We originally only planned it to reach till this video, but we are going to be covering new topics. Stay tuned at the end of the video to learn about what those will be. But Pan-Africanism is a political and philosophical viewpoint, the meaning of which has evolved over time. Generally, it's characterized by the support of the political, social, and cultural unity of Africa and the African diaspora. Unlike the other positions that we've examined in this series, Pan-Africanism is a more recent movement, taking shape in the 1900s and evolving throughout the following century. Pan-Africanism did not begin as a movement actually in Africa. Rather, it began in the African diaspora, people of African descent living not in Africa. Specifically, it began with a group of intellectuals of Sub-Saharan African descent from North America and the Caribbean, such as W.E.B. Du Bois, in the 1910s and 20s. Their goal was the gradual independence of African states from colonial powers. This group saw African identity as something focused primarily on people from Sub-Saharan Africa and their descendants. This early stage of the movement therefore often excluded North Africans, but included the diaspora, given their shared appearance, race, and interaction with white cultures. The hope of some of these thinkers was that a united and free Africa could serve as a homeland for many in the diaspora to return to. They argued for Africa to become independent and quote-unquote civilized through the embrace of Christianity, capitalism, and industrialization. However, these early attempts at Pan-Africanism were critiqued by intellectuals actually on the continent, such as I.T.A. Wallace Johnson, a Sierra Leonean who argued that the ideologies proposed by this movement were the same ideologies used to justify the oppression of African peoples by the colonial powers. Specifically, Wallace Johnson argued that Christianity was used by missions as justification for the brutality of colonialism and forced conversions of African peoples from traditional religions. Wallace Johnson later identified as a Pan-Africanist, though, attending the 6th Pan-African Congress when the movement was more focused on the rejection of European colonialist development ideals instead of kind of this diaspora embrace of those ideals, just without the European masters. Now, African nationalists won a series of victories in the 1950s and 60s with growing independence movements, successfully challenging colonialist powers' claim to a moral right to govern African countries and gaining autonomy. So many of these countries actually were achieving that goal of gaining autonomy from the colonialist powers. However, with the loss of a unified goal of independence, the Pan-Africanist movement fractured. At a broad level, many residents of Africa viewed Pan-Africanism as a movement targeted at the unification of the entire continent, including North African Arabs, under a single political power, while the diaspora viewed the movement as a racial unification of individuals of Sub-Saharan African descent, excluding North African Arabs, but including black peoples around the world. This different perspective on the movement can be seen throughout its history. Now, one challenge was to the Pan-Africanist project on the continent was the difference of views proposed by various countries which competed for the leadership of the movement. Nigeria offered a more capitalist, pro-Western vision, while Kwame Nkrumah, the president of Ghana, envisioned a unified Africa independent and separate from the global economy. Nkrumah was concerned that Africa's reliance on exchanging exports for hard currency was keeping the continent poor. For Nkrumah, this meant a centrally managed socialist development strategy driven by an intensive project of industrialization, essentially turning Africa into a version of what China has become. Nkrumah's vision for Pan-Africanism was inherently socialist, progressive, and centrally managed. Despite Nkrumah's broad rhetoric, the prospective grand unified Africa failed to materialize. In its place, the Organization of African Unity, which later became the African Union, was formed. However, the goals of the OAU fell far short of an idealized single state of Africa with any real political power. While the OAU's goals did exemplify some of the original tenets of Pan-Africanism, such as promoting African unity and development and eradicating colonialism, it also worked to defend the sovereignty of individual states, something antithetical to a single, unified African state. The AU's charter has expanded the powers to intervene in cases of human rights abuses and war crimes, but the institution still remains shy of the original Pan-African ideal of a united governing body for the continent. Now, one of the philosophical positions most closely tied to Pan-Africanism is the idea of communitarian nationalism, that cultures or nations deserve to be ruled by people of the same culture or nation. Check out my videos on nationalism for more on that. This is the idea that states, governments, should coincide with nations or cultures. Anti-colonialist movements used communitarian nationalist arguments against colonialist powers that ruled from afar and imposed different cultural rules and laws on their colonies. And this also speaks to some of the disconnect between the diaspora and people on the continent, because the diaspora viewed themselves in many ways as one nation with one culture, often due to slavery being disconnected from previous African heritages and therefore creating their own cultures in the New World that connected all people who were Black or of Sub-Saharan African descent together, whereas individuals on the continent had very disparate views, cultures, religions, because Africa is such a big, diverse place, and so having a single national identity in that sense was a bit more challenging on the continent as opposed for the diaspora. This unifying philosophy also presaged the fissures that would emerge in the Pan-African movement. While Sub-Saharan African diaspora may share a unique experience of the world, encapsulated in ideas like negritude, that does not mean that they shared a common religion, culture, or set of values required to unite under a single communitarian nation, and particularly that they shared those values with individuals still on the continent. It does raise the interesting question of what bonds are strong enough to unite a country. The African continent is linguistically, culturally, and religiously very diverse, despite shared experiences in many ways. Arguably, the experiences of the African diaspora, particularly living amongst other cultures, are more similar to each other than the experiences of Africans living on the continent are similar to other Africans living on the continent, or even to the diaspora, which might explain the genesis of the Pan-Africanist movement coming from the diaspora viewing themselves as one collective, culturally homogenous nation, as opposed to individuals on the continent who have a wide range of views. Now, so that was Pan-Africanism. Originally, this was planned to be the final video in this series on African philosophy. However, the series has so far really only covered kind of pre-colonial African philosophy, and there's a lot of African philosophy out there that's post-colonial. While exploring these positions is important, and there is also a wealth of modern African philosophy to explore as well, including ideas of negritude, the philosophy of race, colonialism, métissage, and more. So we are going to be expanding this video. I think we're going to be covering probably negritude next. So stay tuned for future videos in this series. But with that, that's the end of our big series on analyzing African philosophy, of the initial start of the series. If you haven't checked out all of the other videos in earlier parts of the series on ethnophilosophy, Ubuntu philosophy, Yoruba epistemology, Akan philosophical psychology, Bantu philosophy, and Ethiopian philosophy, please do that. Check those out. It's a fascinating series. I have really enjoyed making it, and I think it's a set of ideas that there's not as much conversation about, that there can be more conversation about. And stay tuned for future videos in this series on things like negritude. If you like this video and you want to see more and you want to catch those future videos, hit subscribe, hit the notification bell so you don't miss it when we publish a video. And as always, watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.